Hi, everyone. Chris Farrell, the Director of Investigations with Judicial Watch here today with our panel presentation on the deep state. We're going to try to take a look at the deep state, what it is, what it consists of, what it does, its influence or effect on the republic, and maybe we'll raise a question or two about whether there's actually a soft coup going on in the United States. We have a tremendous panel lineup or guests with us today. Very excited to talk with these folks. They'll each open with a short comment or briefing on their views or their points on what the deep state is and what its consequences are for the country. And after we've gone through our three guests, my colleague at Judicial Watch, Jim Peterson, will provide some insight or some legal analysis, and then we'll talk among ourselves and just have a question and answer session. But first, let me introduce Dr. Sebastian Gorka. He is a former deputy assistant to President Donald J. Trump and an internationally recognized counterterrorism expert. Prior to his work for President Trump, Dr. Gorka was professor of strategy and irregular warfare and vice president for national security support at the Institute of World Politics. He also served as the General Horner Distinguished Chair of Military Theory at Marine Corps University Foundation. He is the author of the New York Times bestseller, Defeating Jihad, The Winnable War. Welcome, Seb.
Thank you, Chris.
Also joining us is the best-selling author and columnist, Diana West. She is the author of a few books, but one in particular that I recommend to you is American Betrayal, The Secret Assault on Our Nation's Character. If you haven't read it or if you don't own it, you're wrong. You should do both. Read it. I highly endorse it and recommend it. She's also written The Death of the Grown-Up, How America's Arrested Development in Bringing Down Western Civilization. And she's been a guest and contributor to CNN, Lou Dobbs Show, and many other television shows. And she is a graduate of Yale University. Then, of course, we're also joined by Todd Shepherd. Todd is an investigative reporter with the Washington Examiner. He began his reporting career in radio working as an anchor and reporter for KOMA in Oklahoma City and KOA in Denver. He spent 8 years working as the investigative reporter for the Independence Institute in Colorado, and that's a free market-based think tank for which he was named a top influencer in his reporting. So welcome, Todd.
Great to be here.
And last but not least, I'm joined by my colleague, attorney Jim Peterson with Judicial Watch. In fact, Jim's been with us since 2002. He's a senior attorney with us, and he's contributed greatly to a number of our legal successes, played a huge role in a number of our most important cases, to include our case that went before the Supreme Court concerning Vice President Cheney's Energy Task Force, and has been instrumental in uncovering and revealing documents and government records by compelling their production from the government. He's a member of the bars of the District of Columbia, Virginia, and numerous other federal courts, including the Supreme Court of the United States. So I gave you a quick outline of what we'd like to do, and that is have opening statements from folks, and then a little analysis from a legal perspective from my colleague, Jim Peterson, and then we'll just talk among ourselves about any number of topics relating to the deep state. So first and foremost, I think we'll kick off with Dr. Sebastian Gorka. Seb.
Thank you, Chris. And I'd like to say thank you to you and Tom and the whole Judicial Watch team that really does the work that most of the media should be doing and is, I think, the nation's watchdog. So thank you
very kind of you.
For everything you do. Let me start with a caveat, if I may. I love conspiracy theories, but I love them as entertainment. I have a bookshelf of conspiracy theories at home, but there's a very important part to that phrase, and it's the second word, which is theories. They're not facts. So conspiracy theories and the belief in them undermines clear-sighted analysis. So I'm not here to talk about the outre accusations that have been made against those who are not in favor of the current administration. I want to talk about what actually happened so far. I left the administration 3 weeks ago today, so I've seen the worst of the worst, the first 7 months of how the bureaucracy responded to the administration of Donald J. Trump. And let me start by saying I actually prefer the phrase permanent state to deep state, because it's not necessarily a function of something that's hidden or deep. It was in our faces. It was arrogant. It was right there in the surface of our policy discussions at the highest level of the White House. So it's not hidden. It can be, but in many cases, it's overt. And it's been there for a long time. This isn't just a reaction to a New York mogul who became president. Mm-hmm. This has been brewing for decades, truly decades. And what does it look like? Well, let's look at the factual things. 125 national security leaks in the first 126 days of the administration. So that's practically one a day. Mm-hmm. Not only is that a shocking number by itself, if you compare it to prior administrations, it is 7 times the number of national security leaks under the Bush administration or the Obama administration, taken as an average in the first 6 months. Not twice, not 3 times, 7 times the number of leaks. According to Congress, of those initial leaks, at least 60 of them were of serious national security matters. Every administration leaks. Usually higher-ups are executing some kind of knife fight against each other. But we're talking about national security classified secrets. The idea that the President of the United States, the most powerful man in the world, can't have a confidential conversation with one of his counterparts, another head of state, is the normalcy. And that is very bad for the safety of the nation. Secondly, let me talk about the more subtle aspects of the permanent state. And here I'm going to talk about something I haven't spoken of before. It's not classified, but I think it illustrates the level of the issue. I'm a former professor, so I've taught a lot of young men and women in the national security arena. And when I came on board to work for Steve Bannon as a strategist to the president, I wanted to bring over some of my former students to work with us in the White House who were already in government, who had graduated years ago and were members of the intelligence community. And I identified the 3 best individuals and requested, as a deputy assistant to the president, that these people be detailed over to me at the White House to work on key projects of import to Steve and the president. In the 6 months I was in office, not one of those people was detailed over to me from an unnamed sister agency. And I found out, not only did the sister agency stop their detailing, every single individual was taken off their current duty roster and punished and put into menial tasks outside of the real national security remit through no fault of their own. Why? Because the 7th floor of that agency, to quote a senior individual, looks at the White House as the enemy. Now, let's just let that sink in for a moment. We seem to forget, or it's easy to forget, every single branch of the executive, every single branch, whether it's the Department of Agriculture or the NSA, works for the President of the United States. These aren't alternative competing companies in the free market. They work for the White House. And you are there to serve the interests of the president who has been duly elected by the Electoral College, which represents the American people. The idea that we are the enemy, that leads to very, very dangerous things.
Indeed.
Let me just touch upon a more subtle aspect as well of what I call the permanent state. I've mentioned this before, but it bears reiteration here. I wasn't a member of the NSC, but because of the projects I was working on, I went to frequent meetings of the NSC on issues to do with Qatar, Syria, ISIS, what have you. When you sit in a meeting of the National Security Council, which is the highest decision-making body on policy in the United States government, right? The NSC Policy Coordination, and you sit there for an hour and a half with every high-ranking representative of the administration, whether it's State Department, DOD, CIA, NSA, and you listen to a discussion for more than an hour, and not one person in the room or on the outstations on the video teleconference ever mentions the name of the president what his objectives are, or what he said yesterday in Riyadh or Warsaw or in front of the joint session of Congress, we have a very serious problem. Because they are there not to serve their own understanding of what the nation needs, but to serve the vision of the new CEO, if you will. And if you were in a private company and you disagreed with the new CEO on a key policy of that company, you had two very simple options. Change your mind and support the CEO, or resign, get your box and fill your box with your articles and leave the building. Today, we have a very large number of people in the US government, not just SES, but GS individuals who think, I've been here for 15 years, I'll be here when the president leaves, I know better. That's not democracy, and that's not the American way.
Thank you, Seb. I tell you, that is a level of insight and detail that I have not heard articulated anywhere else in the way that you have. It's very important that I think that our viewers understand that, and that they hear it from you 3 weeks fresh from the White House. Very disturbing, but frankly, in a sense, confirming. Diana, I can remember reading some of your work, and you're talking about Washington in the sense of being occupied. Yes. And that occupation yes. sounds a little bit like the permanent class that Seb was just talking about. So please let us hear from you and your thoughts on this.
Yes, I'm very fascinated by Sebastian's remarks. And I would say that for him, it's upfront and personal. For us on the outside, however, it still seems very murky, very unformed. So when we talk about deep state, which I also am a little uncomfortable with the term, it's very amorphous. So I'll just tell you what I think about. I think about unconstitutional powers exercised by strange, illegitimate branchlets of the government that are in no way restrained by the balance of powers. There are no balance of powers in our country today. Just this week, we watched Senator Rand Paul in the Senate have his bill to restore the war-making powers of the Senate to the Senate blocked by his Senate colleagues. I mean, this is absurd and tragic, but it's the norm. A couple of years ago, we saw the same thing happen with the Senate's treaty-making powers, voted away by the Senate 98-1. This is what we're looking at in terms of no balance of powers. President Trump, now I would say, you know, not having worked for the White House, again, I'm looking at this from a different point of view. Reversing candidate Trump has empowered a bevy of defeated generals, including such high administration officials as H.R. McMaster and the Defense Secretary Mattis, co-author of the failed counterinsurgency doctrine, to send Americans back to the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan without him or anyone else ever holding them accountable. And this is after more than a decade of colossal American losses rooted in bankrupt Islamic apologetics. They just perpetuate these apologetics, as we saw when the president told us to remember 9/11, but forgot to tell us it was 19 devout Muslims on a jihad, including 15 Saudis, who attacked us. This is all related in this mass abdication of responsibility and accountability in our national life that I think is part of the decline of self-government. It's as serious as that, and it enables this unconstitutional power known as the deep state. So we're talking about Washington, but this is a cultural problem. The same force is unaccountable to the people. It is the power that resides in what Sebastian is calling permanent state, in the bureaucracies, in the political parties. We have to think about the internet surveillance state, such as Google and Amazon, and particularly in the national security superstate that has long run amok and is worse than ever, flouting our Fourth Amendment protections daily, without oversight, and with immense and frightening powers. So then we look at the media and the culture and the education system, and we see them all enhancing the same kind of illegitimate power complex, mainly as, not altogether, but mainly as mouthpieces. But even with all of that, I do think we only see a little into this below the surface. And I would credit Judicial Watch and WikiLeaks as being essential to exposing what we do see of the deep state. But I think it's very important to remember that it was Donald Trump himself who provoked the deep state to expose itself. And we can see this when we look just at what we're learning now about the outrageous efforts by the CIA, the FBI, the NSA to insert themselves into the presidential campaign, into the political process in order to destroy his candidacy and presidency. And I just have to wonder, why are they not under serious investigation? Why is their continued survival not dependent on major reform and new transparency? It is Trump who is imperiled. And this may explain his own state of disarray, which looks to many of his supporters sometimes as collapse. The extent to which the deep state is succeeding, the extent to which President Trump has joined forces too often to destroy his own agenda, makes it unlikely, it seems, that we will actually expose much more of this mechanism, and much more important, arouse the political and legal will to destroy it and restore constitutional governance. Because exposure alone is not enough. But I think it's crucial to remember, if only maybe for point of reference or point of renewal during this administration, that candidate Trump first provoked the deep state into the open with a specific set of forbidden issues. Immigration restriction and selectivity, including some block on Muslim immigration, nationalist trade and tariffs, an end to wars that are not fought over American core interests, and the restoration of American sovereignty. We, the people, were never supposed to vote on these issues, these foundational issues of nationhood, ever again. Real and respectable presidential candidates never even mentioned them. These issues had been essentially taken from us by the powers that always seemed to be. They were settled, and then along came Trump. So I think it's this set of forbidden issues that offers also the most obvious clues to the ideological drivers of the state within the state that we sense, we see evidence of. It shows itself to be fanatically globalist and anti-nationalist. It is interventionist. It favors mass immigration and even open borders. It supports free trade, and it is also, to invoke a rather antique concept, perhaps, soft on Islam, which I would say has something to do with the insertion into the Washington food chain of Islamic supremacists, including those related to Muslim Brotherhood organizations. None of these positions add up to small r republicanism. Quite the contrary, these are building blocks of a socialist paradise, regardless of the labels people choose to identify themselves. And I'm not exaggerating, I mean that quite literally. During my own campaign coverage, I was able to find striking similarities between the beliefs of mainstream anti-Trump Republicans and the program set forth in a 1932 book called Towards Soviet America. It was written by William Z. Foster, chairman of the Communist Party USA, which means it was approved, if not actually written in Moscow. These similarities were especially strong when it came to the forbidden Trump issues: immigration, trade, and what Foster called bigoted nationalist chauvinism. Now, I'm not suggesting that Republicans and Democrats, who of course have more in common with the Soviet American program, are Communist Party members, but just trying to demonstrate the extent to which communistic ideas have shaped and transformed our politics and even wholly shifted the spectrum. They also characterize the political impetus, I believe, of this permanent state. So we're at this point of exposure, and then the question is, what happens? As Judicial Watch can attest, not very often very much happens, and I'm afraid historically this is typical. I'm thinking back to the historical deep state that you earlier referenced, once upon a time known as the Communist Conspiracy. Exposure wasn't enough even back then, and the reason I say that is the era today is still widely characterized as a Red Scare created by conspiracy theorists, which means that the Communist Party line, the old deep state line, has come to, at least as far as popular consciousness, been the one that sets the narrative. This has blinded us to subsequent forces of subversion of all kinds. Now, this was not conspiracy theory, as I think Seb would agree. We have hard evidence of hundreds, if not thousands, of Soviet agents in and around the halls of power in Washington by the middle of the last century. And that doesn't even include numerous communists and fellow travelers around town. These agents met with handlers, they took secret orders from Moscow. That's a conspiracy, and it was communist. They stole government secrets, but far more important, these unaccountable members of a de facto shadow government, certainly under Franklin Roosevelt and after. They sought to influence or even just mess up, as Whittaker Chambers once said, policymakers and policymaking, war making too, which sounds very familiar. So I look forward to discussing what to do about this. We have a lot to draw on from our past if we just look at these lessons.
Thank you, Dana. Very insightful. Certainly, I enjoyed your commentary, or I found it very intriguing about the idea, excuse me, that the American public was never supposed to vote on this.
Right.
It's a forbidden topic.
Yes.
So then we turn to our friend Todd, and looking at this whole question from the perspective of a journalist, writing and reporting and interviewing. Give us your thoughts on where we are and where we're going.
Well, first of all, thank you, Chris, for having me here, and
Sure.
thanks for holding this panel, and of course, thanks for all of the, like Dr. Gorka said, all of the remarkable FOIA work that Judicial Watch does to bring so much information to the American public. My discussion, my opening remarks today focuses less, if we're talking about the deep state as a group of maybe not the highest level of appointees, but maybe the middle level or lower level appointees, or even just the career officials within a bureaucracy. My discussion's a little less on the actual inside obstruction that Mr. Gorka, or that Dr. Gorka, excuse me, described, where he handpicked these aides and they were blocked from ever getting to him. As you mentioned, I'll sort of look at this from a media standpoint. And so I think what we're talking about really is how can a group of persons within a bureaucracy, one of these agencies under the executive's control, how can they use their power to manipulate information and manipulate that flow to the American people? So I think when we start with that broad umbrella, that really splits itself into two parts, which is they either manipulate the information itself or they manipulate the flow, and somehow, to some degree, they co-opt the media into being willing or unwitting agents in a very selective flow of information. And I'm sure Dr. Gorka probably has some experience with that in his months at the White House. So let's, for the moment, start by examining leaks, because this is how we sort of think of this, at least in the first months of the Trump administration, as Dr. Gorka explained, 125 leaks in 126 days. There have been, since Mr. Trump's inauguration, because in particular the president has pushed back so hard on the media, I think there's been a growing awareness about the media's use of anonymous sources. And I think the public, whereas they might have casually looked at this before, they pay much closer attention to the use of anonymous sources right now. And in a sense, I view the information flow from the government to the public via the media as a zero-sum game. So now there's an infinite amount of information that can get to the public, but they still have a 100%, there's a 100% piece of the pie, and how much of that information gets to them is a zero-sum game. And I believe that because the Freedom of Information Act in our country now is so broken that it is only natural now that the media is so highly dependent upon anonymous sources. And if we can do something about the weakness of the Federal Freedom of Information Act, then we have the potential for the media to rely far less on anonymous sources. And of course, when these sources are anonymous, they have the ability to be highly selective about what makes it to the public, and as long as it's selective, the public is not fully informed. So I have been troubled that while there's been an outrage over the leaks and over the anonymous sources, in my opinion, there has sadly been a dearth of a groundswell of opinion from the hoi polloi about the fact that our basic functions of transparency are so broken. I believe the average American, though, understands quite clearly that it's ironic and it's shameful that the government can have their phone logs within a matter of days, but I, as a reporter, cannot get the bureaucrats' phone logs for a matter of months. That's how broken our Freedom of Information Act laws are. And of course, if FOIA is broken, let me create a hypothetical question. Is the average American willing to have their IRS taxes go up by $5 every year in order to double or triple the bureaucracy within the Freedom of Information departments alone within these agencies, such that information can be pulled out in a month's time rather than a year's time? if that's even possible. As I'm sure Judicial Watch will attest, you either sue or you don't get the documents these days. Very quickly before I go on, I just want to read the preamble to the Texas Public Records Act, because again, as we talk about Freedom of Information Act, it's just a few sentences, but it sets the tone so beautifully. Under the fundamental philosophy of the American constitutional form of representative government that adheres to the principle that government is the servant and not the master of the people, it is the policy of this state that each person is entitled, unless otherwise expressly provided by law, at all times to complete information about the affairs of government and the official acts of public officials and employees. The people, in delegating that authority, do not give their public servants the right to decide what is good for the people to know and what is good for them not to know. The people insist on remaining informed so that they may retain control over the instruments they have created. The provisions of this chapter shall be liberally construed to that end. So I think we're all very familiar with the phrase, justice delayed is justice denied, but there's a corollary there, and that is information delayed is more power into the hands of a bureaucracy. I did see a great story the other day by the Daily Caller, the investigative reporter there, Ethan Barton, and I admit I was a little jealous by this scoop, but he had a story where I believe it was Mother Jones. Let's use that hypothetically, that Mother Jones had requested some information, and what was eventually turned over to them was about 1,000 emails. They were able to get this within 4 months. There is no such corresponding effort for conservative outlets who have been able to, right. And I can attest to that myself. A quick note about some stories that I was able to break in my time in Colorado. I was able to break a series of stories on the Colorado Department of Corrections. And in that case, I did have a whistleblower who was working with me. But also in this case, because the open records laws work so well, this person essentially never gave me information that I had to rely on their information alone. I always took that information and was able to go do an open records request on it. What was great about this was it denied him the ability now to be selective in what I was eventually seeing. So again, I think there's got to be some congressional chutzpah here about getting some eventual FOIA reform. Now just a couple of quick comments about the media itself, and I'm going to put out a couple of hypotheticals. These are just sort of thought experiments, but what would we do in the media if at some point media consumers started to demand the unseen from media when we have these leaks? So let's start off with an example. The New York Times report on the Comey memos that he had kept on the Trump discussions. What if the New York Times had also told us the things that whistleblower would not answer when they were on the phone with him? That's a very titillating experiment in my mind, because now all of a sudden it gives us the greater ability to see whether or not that leaker has an agenda. How about this hypothetical? And I realize this is very borderline, but we just push the boundaries here to see where our thought experiment can go. What if the media, like the Washington Post or the New York Times, created leaker profiles? So we have a leaker within the FBI, let's say, and we name that person Daffy Duck. And Daffy Duck leaks the Comey memos. Now, 3 months later, Daffy Duck leaks something else, and they say, by the way, this was Daffy Duck who also leaked us the Comey memos. So now all of a sudden, the public has the ability to build a profile of these leakers, and we start
You did a lot of profiles.
Finally, my last experiment here, and then I'll conclude my remarks, is what I call it the Watergate experiment. But imagine we're back in 1973 and Deep Throat is making the series of leaks to the Washington Post. If you were a New York Times reporter and you knew who Deep Throat was, would the New York Times have published that story? Would they have outed Deep Throat's identity? And the question to that is very revealing, the answer to that, I'm sorry, is very revealing as to the media's attitudes and whether or not they're willing to be complicit, as you said, in any sort of coup or overthrow. In my mind, if the New York Times has that information, they ought to publish it. And I think, to make a literal analogy to right now, the question is, if someone knows the identity who leaked the Michael Flynn transcript, would they publish? And I think the media consuming public right now doesn't know the answer to that question.
Excellent, Todd. Two points come to mind. One is, of course, the Michael Flynn story. It's a very small circle of persons who would have access to transcripts of that type of SIGINT collection. There's people who have gone their entire careers in the intelligence world and have never seen a transcript. So that's one interesting point. The other thing I wanted to bring up is, I teach journalism law at George Mason University. And I will say to students, the Constitution is the American people telling the government what it can and cannot do. And I get very worried looks. People look at it, you mean because there's this overriding belief that, it's pay, pray, and obey. You're issued orders and you will comply.
They know better.
And get your entitlements, So it's very interesting how young journalists now entering the field, and this is a class of seniors, it's a 400 series class, their appreciation for rights and it's everything you said just brought it into focus. So Jim, we have three excellent panelists. I'm very impressed with what everyone has said. Maybe a couple of legal points have come up or some little commentary or analysis from our legal perspective on some of what we've heard here.
Sure, thank you, Chris. As you said, I'm an attorney with Judicial Watch, where we try to use the Freedom of Information Act to penetrate the deep state, or maybe the permanent state is probably the better way to do it. And we've been doing this for a long time, and we've had a lot of success, particularly toward the end of the Obama administration, where we uncovered a lot of the really critical information relating to Hillary's email server. And this is relevant kind of to what we're discussing now, because it provides a good contrast in showing how little actually changes the very definition of a permanent or deep state. We fought the State Department and the rest of the Justice Department and anybody else, for Hillary's emails last year, and in difficult litigation at each turn. So when Donald Trump was elected, we thought, we weren't necessarily certain of it, but we thought there was at least a decent chance that we might be something new, that the Obama administration the perspective of the Obama administration would change with the Trump administration. Boy, was that naive. I mean, we thought that there would be a change, but literally on day one and ever since, it has continued. The fight has continued. If anything, it's just as difficult, it's just as intense, the opposition to anything we're trying to do. The State Department, the Justice Department still fight tooth and nail at each stage, prevent anything coming out, whether it's Hillary email related, things that could be easily released at the discretion of the government at any moment. It doesn't require any significant action, but the same people are still there. They're not just at each of the agencies that are in control, but also at the Justice Department in the litigation. It's the same people that are still in control, and whether, as Dr. Gorka said, well, whether it was an election, it doesn't matter. We're here, we're going to be here, and we'll be here long after any this is over. So that's why we see this really remarkable situation where, even though there's a new president, new policies, and new perspectives on things, nothing changes. We still have an IRS with a commissioner in place. Lois Lerner doesn't get prosecuted for the outrageous abuses that occurred there. We have open acknowledgement. Nobody's even trying to hide that at the EPA and other federal agencies, they're using encrypted cell phone technology to communicate with other federal employees. Open violation of the law. There's no doubt about it. They don't even hide it. They're proud of it because it's their way to try to accomplish what is their goals, despite what may or may not be coming from the White House. I mean, these are really remarkable examples of how democracy isn't working, as has been said. There isn't any change in policy. The permanent state, the deep state, the bureaucracy is intent to remain and is planning to. And despite the efforts that we make through the courts to try to penetrate the deep state and find out, it's difficult at every stage. They could do so much if they wanted to open up and provide this information to the American people at any point, but they choose not to. I mean, this is really the remarkable thing, that that the democracy does not seem to make a difference to them, and despite our efforts, we're still struggling against what we now really have confronted with as a deep state.
Thank you, Jim. So what comes to mind for me in hearing everything that everyone said here is that, I have to look at demographics. And if you think about Washington, D.C., 94% of Washington, D.C. voted for Hillary Clinton. If you go to Prince George's County, it's something like 89%. If you go to Arlington, it's something like 87%. And so if you think about Washington, D.C. and sort of the bedroom communities around the city itself, when that population gets up in the morning and goes to work and staffs and mans the departments and agencies of the government, they're in the 80th percentile upwards, generally, anti-President Trump. And so that is the headquarters. That's the leadership of each of the departments and agencies. And of course, they have various subordinate elements scattered around the country. But that is what a new administration faces. And traditionally, the left is quite comfortable with the organs of the state, right, and the levers of management. They love policies and programs and departments, and you find, generally speaking, the right doesn't. And so you find people that come into government with a Republican or a right-of-center administration, when they're done, they go home. They go back to their business.
Like
and they go,
Washington.
Yeah, but the left stays here. And that is this entrenched, you can call it the deep state, you can call it the permanent state, you can call it a professional political class, a fourth branch of government. But what I think is disheartening to people is they see Koskinen still at the IRS, they see all the things that Jim mentioned, they see occupied Washington with this sort of, if you walk it back to the Comintern, I mean, 100 years ago, you can find the initiative started. The frustration you experienced, a special assistant to the president asking for staff and not just being blocked, but having your associates punished because they're associated with you. This is mind-boggling stuff. So my first question to you is, this all leads to the mentality of laws or for the little people.
Sure.
Hillary Clinton and James Comey, do either of them ever get prosecuted?
No, I'm afraid not. I hate to break the news to you.
Why not?
I just what the situation you describe is overwhelming. But I think more importantly, President Trump himself has signaled that he does not wish to pursue Hillary Clinton publicly. What you describe further boggles my mind on the question I've had since day one of this administration, which maybe Sebastian can speak to, is why President Trump did not bring in more people who supported his agenda, the people who campaigned with him, who might have had experience, for example, a Newt Gingrich, a Rudy Giuliani, a Sarah Palin, the Sheriff of Ohio. What is the answer?
Do, yeah.
Steve Bannon said the other day that within 48 hours, they had made a decision to not support the deep state, but to literally, the quote was, to embrace the establishment. 48 hours of election day. This was on 60 Minutes. I think it's the bombshell news of 60 Minutes. He called it perhaps the original sin, I would agree, of the Trump administration. What was that, a deep state maneuver? What's going on with that? How is there no?
Yeah, in big issues, there's never a univalent answer. So whatever Steve said, and I worked for Steve, that's not the answer to all of these things. It's a combination of issues. My personal experience is I was on the transition team. So before the election, I was brought in to work in a federal building with people who were expected to shape the potential administration's transition. And I met with some great people. I mean, I worked in a building, I was on the NSC transition team, but we had everything in the building, DHS, state, CIA. And then as the last week before the inauguration approaches, and their expectations of, well, if I'm the DHS transition team, then I'm going to go to DHS or what have you. And I start filling out my paperwork to go into the White House. And I asked people, so I'll see you in there, right? And I kept meeting people who'd been stalwart supporters of this transition, who'd worked outrageous hours for free often as volunteers, as experts, and say, oh, no, I'm not coming in. And why not? Because I now know what it costs to go in. After my 8 months in the administration, after having not only myself attacked, that's fine. I mean, that's what I expect. But having my dead mother, my wife, my teenage son attacked by the media, you have to be insane to go into government or a crusader. So number one, it's not, you don't flick a switch and then hordes of people volunteer to come in, okay?
I know hordes
you
of
may
people.
know hordes of people, but just because they were, putting in yard signs in Arlington doesn't necessarily mean they can run in the intelligence
No, I
community.
know people who can do
and the
that.
other thing is,
Yes,
and the
who
other
were
thing
shut
is,
out.
we need to understand what happened on November the 8th. On November the 8th, it's like, the movie Red Dawn. A scrappy bunch of insurgents won a campaign. I mean, the rank outsider who wasn't taken seriously by anybody wiped the floor with 16 members of the establishment,
Sure.
and then beat a woman who'd spent $700 million for a position she thought was owed to her. So we didn't come in with the schlep of the GOP. This wasn't, Bush Mark III coming in. It was me, Steve, and 20 other guys and gals who came in. I know a lot of people should have brought in who weren't, but the fact is you have to bring them in through a policy personnel process. And who often runs those?
The leftists.
Right, right. So the establishment's running your wickets for your own personnel. And let me tell you something. I'll give you the inside baseball, and I hope the good guys are listening, okay? If you ever want to take control of the U.S. government as a good guy, the secret is very simple. Make sure your people are the Sherpas. Okay, the Sherpa is a technical term for the individual in transition who guides the incoming cabinet member into their new agency. And I watched Sherpas who had nothing, and I mean nothing to do with the presidential campaign, nothing to do with his platform, and who were in some cases never Trumpers, guide this incoming cabinet member into their position and then roll in to be their chief of staff and basically become the secretary. So guys, next generation of good guys out there, make sure your Sherpas are in place after the election.
Is that even possible?
That's another question.
Okay.
That's another question.
Yeah, I mean, it's a legitimate question. Diana, if we put a room full of this permanent political class, this fourth estate or fourth branch of government, and there were Republicans and Democrats and lobbyists and media types, and you put them all in a room, would you be able to separate out who's who? Could you discern?
Maybe by their shoes. No, I mean, that is the point of another concept that gained currency during this past campaign, the uniparty, the shared belief system of both parties, which I think really was starkly illustrated when I found that book, Toward Soviet America, and saw how much of the Republican mainstream beliefs actually started in this 1932 Soviet tract, which is pretty shocking. But on the other hand, it's not that when you actually see Donald Trump walking into the propeller, having brought up all of the foundational issues involving a restoration of the nation state, which essentially is, I believe, what this permanent bureaucracy, which is quite socialistic and communistic and collectivistic in its utopian mindset, was so outraged for, and that why we did see this extent of exposure and why we did see this I mean, I still can't grasp the idea of this, what seems to be the case. I think Tom Fitton was talking about it recently, that the FBI was paying for the expert behind the dodgy dossier. I mean, this hasn't even really played out yet, but this does seem to be where we are with the story. And then ended up shopping the thing around during an election campaign. I mean, the idea of the FBI having anything to do with opposition research during our domestic democratic process is mind-boggling. But then we see the CIA director, and we see all of them essentially colluding. I mean, my own theory, I think that a lot of this had to do with creating an act of deflection in terms of the Russian influence story that suddenly has disappeared somewhat, in terms of deflecting all the terrible things that a Trump administration might have found out in the Stasi-like security state that we are now living under. That's just a little hunch, but it has that feeling of ersatz quality. But yes, in terms of the typical Washington pool of people, that is very true, and they do have the same goals and ideas. They seem to separate on certain social issues more than anything else, but in terms of the mainstream, there's great similarities, which again is why Trump was so inconvenient, so unexpected, and really never should happen. And it could be that one man couldn't change this. We don't know. We're
going to find
yeah.
out. Todd, the guys at the New Yorker and the Nation and the New York Times, they laugh at this. They say, deep state, permanent state. Nonsense. This is, so there's an entire, some would say the vast majority of people in the news media would say, this is all preposterous. And proof of it being preposterous is, you got Trump elected. Of course, it wouldn't be possible if this boogeyman of the permanent deep state were true. What do you say to that?
Well, the bureaucracy it's still one vote, one person. So, and they, as you said, they all live in Prince George's County and Alexandria and Arlington and so forth. I think, though, there was still an opportunity, though, for this administration. Just as Jim has talked about, there's been no shift that we've seen policy-wise for a lot of information to be broken free. And not even all of this has to be broken free about the previous administration. Let me just give you sort of an example. We're very familiar with the fact, with the idea of the way the maverick things President Trump did on the campaign trail. I'm drawn specifically to him giving out Lindsey Graham's phone number in the middle of a debate. I wonder why, let's suppose, for example, that if I were going to guess where is there a deep state that's actually working right now, that's not in the intelligence agencies, my guess would be the EPA. That'd be my number one agency. If there really is deep state sabotage going on there, then at some point it's incumbent on Scott Pruitt and the others there to give Lindsey Graham's phone number out. And if they have good proof, a body of evidence and not selective cherry-picked proof, present that to the American people. Let the New York Times and the Washington Post editorialize against it. This will do nothing but consolidate and rally the president's base and rally his troops. And I'm not suggesting that as a strategy. I personally have no interest whether those troops are rallied or consolidated. I'm just telling you that's a natural conclusion of what will happen if Scott Pruitt came out and said, here's what this agency did to us in the last 3 months to sabotage our agenda. The Make America Great hats would be all over Main Street again.
Mm-hmm. So there has to be enough sort of courage of conviction. I often ask a couple of general officer friends of mine, where's today's Billy Mitchell? And there isn't one. So this would take a courage of conviction, a willingness to expose stuff, the system in a way we've never seen anyone ever do.
But this illustrates the natural problem when you have a candidate and then an elected that is so wildly charismatic and unpredictable as the president was. It's very difficult to say, well, now go pick 18 department heads that are just like you or that have the willingness or the spine or the thick skin to carry out some of these activities.
Or the direction of the RNC.
Yeah,
right. Because they're part of the problem or part of the the colossus, the leviathan, right? They're there.
The GOP.
Yes, but Judicial Watch has put so much on a plate.
We have.
Alone. I mean, just going back to...
We truly have. Yeah.
Truly have. You don't even have to bother the agency head in this case necessarily. The thing I think that is impossible to understand for so many Trump supporters is what happened with Lois Lerner and the IRS, what happened with the pay-to-play cases, what happened with and you can just start enumerating them. We could spend the whole time just enumerating cases where evidence has been developed and there has been no official investigative a mechanism started by this. It just sits there.
So there's 3 days in a row where a White House spokesperson came out and was highly critical of former FBI Director Comey. And even the FBI would call that a clue, right? On the third day you're coming out to condemn Comey's activity. But I mean, just think about this for a second. Comey's in front of the Senate Intelligence Committee. He's under oath testifying. He admits that he's leaked these memos and that he did so with the intention of manipulating the legal system for the appointment of a special counsel.
And he wasn't embarrassed by that at all.
And the senators sitting there thanked him and told him what a great American he is. And he's done all this under oath. I mean, arguably, he should have been read his rights and put in cuffs. He's just made an admission against his own interests under oath in front of a Senate Intelligence Committee. But they applaud him as a hero, and he walks out to get a book deal and to play martyr. This is mind-boggling to me. And I have a question. I mean, there's got to be all sorts of internal pressure. There has to be an awareness within the White House and at that level of what the hell's going on? I mean, how are they getting away with this? I mean, these are very smart people. I know you're a very smart guy. You were in there. I mean, there's got to be this notion of, well, we can't just let this stand. Even if the president were to go out and say, you know what, this is a lot of garbage in his own kind of Queens, New York style, say, hey, this is unacceptable and here's why. And people should be following his lead, but I don't see that, and that's very hard.
Look, there's massive, so first things first, I need to push back on what my friend Diana said. You cannot use the adjective Stasi for America today, okay? So as the child of people who suffered under communism with a father who was tortured, people aren't getting shot and put in unmarked graves in America. So let's pause for a second, let's take a deep breath. Let's map the problems with our political system, but remember, it's still America, and this isn't the Soviet Union, and this isn't East Germany. It's deeper than just malefactors who think they know better. We have to be wise about mapping the whole thing, because the other thing you said is very important. There's a philosophical aspect to all of this. It's not just people who say, hey, I'm smarter than the president and I'm a GS-15 and I don't care. Right. There's an establishment on the right and left that has a shared philosophy and has done for 20, if not 30 years. Not because they're communists or not because they're crypto whatevers. It's because they believe in the kinds of things Hillary said to that group of bankers in Brazil, right? What did she say? We don't need no stinking borders in the hemisphere. Yeah. I mean, get rid of borders. You nailed that. You said nation state, the importance of the nation state. Everybody needs to understand this isn't just a guy from Queens who's a reality TV star and a billionaire in realty. There's a philosophical substance to everything we did last year, whether it's the wall, whether it's ISIS, whether it's the economy, whether it's supporting Brexit. The philosophical underpinnings of what put Donald J. Trump into the White House is sovereignty. Okay? That a sovereign nation is a healthy nation. And the swamp vehemently, philosophically disagrees with that. It's not about necessarily subverting this conservative. It's about, you know what, we believe in sovereignty as a negative concept. Globalization is the future, this utopian vision of a borderless world. So we need to wake up to not just finding subversives and doing, single scope polygraphs through the whole EOB. I mean, when Mike Flynn was still in office, one day he said to me, after our phone book, we hadn't even approved, he hadn't signed off on the new NSC phone book, and already the Washington Post had it, or somebody had it leaked. And he said, I want to polygraph every employee in this building. And I said, Mike, do it. right? But you have to execute. You have to execute on that intent, because single scope polygraphs are very powerful tools. You know that, right?
I do. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. So, Jim, when it comes to the legal tools available, certainly there's an entire body of evidence that Judicial Watch has uncovered through depositions of people like Cheryl Mills and Huma Abedin and others. What's your guess? Has the Attorney General impaneled a grand jury to look at Comey, or to have a relook, a de novo review of Clinton?
Well, that's a good question. I suspect if he had, we would know, because it would have been leaked three months ago.
Like Special Counsel Mueller, right? All of the leaks coming out of the Special Counsel's
because
office.
it would. So. I'm a believer in the power of our institutions, in that whether one side or the other side, we're stronger than any particular person or idea, but because our institutions and our Constitution, are there to protect us. But these are troubling things when the institutions are no longer moved by elections, and they're moving on their own. And those are the questions we have to look at very seriously, I think. So.
Well, let me thank each and every one of you for joining us today. It's been a fascinating conversation. I could do this for another hour or two, frankly. There's all sorts of things that we haven't even touched on. To the folks at home watching us, Judicial Watch promotes transparency, integrity, and accountability in government politics and the law. We've been doing it now for 24 years. We'll continue to do it. My colleague Jim has been with us for 15 years. I've been around for 17. We don't stop. We don't quit. We don't forget. And you can count on us to continue to do that. And you can count on us also to have excellent panelists that have joined us today to talk about very important public policy issues. And please go to judicialwatch.org and watch this video, share it with your friends. Thanks for joining us. We really appreciate it.